The morning mist hung low over Oak Ridge like a gray blanket, softening the edges of a town that had seen better days. Jack Warner stood at his kitchen window, watching the sun struggle through the clouds as he nursed his second cup of coffee. The ceramic mug, a Father's Day gift from Lisa 3 years ago, when she still believed he could fix anything, felt warm against his calloused palms. At 42, Jack carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had learned to bear weight without complaint. His brown hair showed threads of silver at the temples earned through 2 years of widowhood and 6 months of unemployment. The laugh lines around his green eyes had deepened into something more permanent, carved by sleepless nights spent staring at unpaid bills and unanswered job applications. The house around him told the story of a family doing their best to hold things together. Marie's presence lingered in every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every family photograph still hanging exactly where she'd placed them. The living room still held her favorite reading chair, a burgundy recliner that neither Jack nor Lisa had the heart to move. Her books remained on the side table, romance novels and gardening magazines she'd never finished reading. He set the half-empty mug down and picked up the stack of envelopes he'd been avoiding. The electric bill was 2 weeks past due. The property tax notice had arrived with an ominous red stamp. But it was the mortgage statement that made his stomach knot, 3 months behind, and a formal notice of foreclosure proceedings that would begin in 14 days unless he could come up with $4,200. The factory job that had supported them for 15 years had vanished, along with the rest of Oak Ridge's manufacturing base. His unemployment benefits had run out 2 months ago, and the savings Marie had carefully built up during her years as a school secretary had been consumed by medical bills and funeral expenses. Lisa's voice carried down the stairs, tinged with the particular frustration of a 16-year-old running late for school. She appeared in the kitchen doorway moments later, her auburn hair, so much like her mother's, pulled back in a messy ponytail. Dark circles under her brown eyes spoke of another restless night, though she'd never admit to the nightmares that still visited her dreams. Lisa had grown 3 inches in the past year, as if grief had stretched her toward adulthood too quickly. She moved with Marie's grace but carried Jack's stubborn set to her jaw. The combination made her beautiful in a way that terrified him, especially when she looked at him with disappointment that cut deeper than any criticism from his neighbors. "Mrs. Henderson called again yesterday," Lisa said, shouldering her backpack. "About the mortgage." Jack's jaw tightened. At 16, Lisa shouldn't know about mortgage payments or past due notices, but poverty had a way of stripping away the luxury of childhood innocence. "I'll handle it." "With what money?" The question hung in the air between them, brutal in its honesty. Jack reached over and squeezed her shoulder. "I know. I'm working on it." She nodded, but he could see the worry in her eyes. Lisa had inherited Marie's practical nature along with her beauty, and she understood their situation better than Jack sometimes wished. After Lisa left for school, Jack walked through the house that had once felt like a sanctuary and now felt more like a shrine. He paused at the mantelpiece where a photograph of Marie smiled at him from their wedding day. She wore her grandmother's dress and carried wildflowers from their neighbor's garden because they couldn't afford a professional bouquet. She'd been beautiful, but more than that, she'd been steady, the kind of woman who could stretch a dollar until it screamed and still make their small house feel like a palace. "I don't know what to do, Marie," he whispered to the photograph. "I'm failing her." The silence that answered him felt heavy with judgment. Marie would have known exactly how to handle their financial crisis. She would have found a way to make their situation work without sacrificing Lisa's future or their family's dignity. Instead, Lisa was stuck with a father who had spent his career following other people's instructions and now found himself lost without a roadmap. The phone rang, interrupting his self-recrimination. The caller ID showed Thompson's salvage yard, and Jack felt his heart skip. Old Howard Thompson had called 3 days ago about something he thought might interest Jack, something about his father's railroad days. "Jack Howard Thompson. You still thinking about what we talked about?" "I'm still thinking." Jack had been doing more than thinking. He'd been lying awake at night, turning Howard's words over in his mind like stones in a river. "Well, I got another buyer coming to look at her tomorrow. Railroad enthusiast from Chicago with deep pockets. If you want her, you better come today." Jack closed his eyes. $3,000. It was everything he had left in their checking account. Money that should go toward the mortgage payment due in 2 weeks. Money that represented the difference between keeping their home and joining the growing number of Oak Ridge families who'd lost everything. But something in his chest pulled tight when he thought about letting that locomotive disappear into some collector's private museum. His father, Raymond Warner, had worked the railroad for 43 years before a heart attack took him when Jack was 25. Raymond had been a quiet man who spoke in practical terms about practical things. But sometimes, usually late at night when he thought his son was sleeping, Jack had heard him talking to himself about trains that carried more than freight and secrets that died with the men who kept them. "I'll be there in an hour," Jack heard himself say. The decision to leave the house felt like stepping off a cliff. Jack pulled on his worn work jacket and headed for the garage, where he paused to look at the stack of cardboard boxes he'd been meaning to sort through for years. His father's things packed away after the funeral and mostly untouched since then. Something about Howard's call had stirred memories, and Jack found himself pulling down a dusty box labeled Dad's Workshop in faded marker. Inside was a jumble of papers, photographs, and small tools that had belonged to Raymond Warner. Jack had always meant to organize it properly to preserve his father's legacy in some meaningful way, but life had a habit of pushing such tasks to tomorrow. Near the bottom of the box, a yellowed envelope caught his attention. The handwriting on it was his father's neat, precise lettering that spelled out, "For Jack when the time comes." A strange chill ran down his spine. He'd packed these boxes himself after his father's death and had never noticed this envelope. Or perhaps he had, but hadn't been ready to see what "when the time comes" might mean. Jack slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket, suddenly certain that whatever Howard Thompson wanted to show him was connected to its contents. Thompson's salvage yard occupied 10 acres of what had once been prime farmland on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. Generations of discarded dreams rusted under the Indiana sky, abandoned cars, obsolete farm equipment, and the remnants of the town's industrial past. Howard Thompson had inherited the business from his father and had been buying and selling scrap for 30 years, developing an eye for what had value and what was simply junk. The locomotive sat on a section of track behind the main office, looking like a sleeping giant. Engine 447 had been built in 1943, according to the faded numbers still visible on her side. She was a Baltimore and Ohio class S160 freight engine designed for hauling heavy loads across the Midwest during the war years. Now rust covered her black paint like a reddish beard, and weeds grew up through the gaps in her undercarriage. "She's been sitting here for 2 years, Howard said, walking around the engine with the reverence of a man who appreciated good craftsmanship. Bought her from the B&O when they were scrapping the old steam engines. Always meant to restore her, but hell, I'm 73 years old. What am I going to do with a locomotive?" Jack ran his hand along the engine's side, feeling the rough texture of rust flakes and old paint. Something about touching the metal made his chest tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. "You said she reminded you of my father." Tom worked on engines like this during the war. He had a way with the old steam engines that the younger guys never quite mastered. Howard's weathered face creased with memory. He used to say these engines had souls. Said if you listen close enough, they'd tell you their stories. Jack circled the locomotive, slowly taking in its massive proportions. The rusted exterior couldn't hide the solid engineering beneath the precision cast wheels, still true on their axles, the once gleaming brass fittings now dulled with age, but still intact. Even in its deteriorated state, there was something majestic about the machine, a testament to an era when American industry built things to last. She runs, last time anyone tried was 15 years ago. Boiler's been cold since then, but the mechanics are sound. Your dad would have loved working on her. The main valve chambers still have their original fittings, brass bushings with a 1/4-inch tolerance that you don't see in modern equipment. The cylinder timing gears is a wall-shared system, same as what your father specialized in at the B&O shops. The technical details sparked something in Jack's memory, evenings spent in his father's workshop, learning the names of tools and parts that seemed to belong to another world. Raymond Warner had wanted his son to understand the elegant complexity of steam power, how the careful orchestration of steam pressure and precision machined metal could move mountains across a continent. Jack thought about Lisa's practical questions and his own practical concerns. $3,000 could buy 3 months of mortgage payments or groceries for the rest of the year, or 1,000 other things they actually needed. But when he looked at engine 447, he didn't see a piece of scrap metal. He saw his father's hands moving with practiced precision over similar machinery, heard his father's voice talking about trains that carried secrets and stories that outlived the men who lived them. "I'll take her." The transaction took an hour. Howard handled the paperwork with the efficiency of a man who had sold thousands of pieces of discarded dreams over the decades. Jack signed the title transfer and wrote a check that left their checking account with $47.32. By the time he drove home, word of his purchase had already spread through Oak Ridge's efficient gossip network. Mrs. Patterson from the post office was in her front yard when he pulled into his driveway. She gave him a look that mixed pity with disbelief, the same look she'd worn at Marie's funeral when she thought no one was watching. Two houses down, Bob Miller was washing his truck and pretending not to stare, but Jack could feel the weight of his neighbor's judgment. Lisa was waiting in the kitchen when he walked through the door. Her school books were spread across the table, but her attention was focused entirely on him. Jenny Patterson says you bought a train, a locomotive. With what money? The question carried the same brutal honesty as the morning's conversation, but now it was sharpened with something that looked like betrayal. Jack sat down across from her, suddenly feeling older than his 42 years. I know how it sounds. It sounds crazy. Lisa's voice cracked slightly. Dad, we can't pay the mortgage, and you just spent $3,000 on a piece of junk that doesn't even run. It's not junk. The words came out more sharply than he intended. Your grandpa's been dead for 17 years. Lisa's composure finally cracked and tears spilled down her cheeks. He's not coming back, and neither is Mom, and buying some stupid train isn't going to bring either of them back. She ran upstairs, leaving Jack alone with the weight of his decision and the echo of her footsteps overhead. Through the kitchen window, he could see Bob Miller still pretending to wash his truck while actually keeping watch on the Warner house, no doubt gathering details for tomorrow's coffee shop conversations. That evening, after Lisa had locked herself in her room with her homework and her anger, Jack drove back to Thompson's salvage yard. The locomotive looked different in the fading daylight, less like a discarded piece of machinery and more like something waiting patiently for its purpose to be revealed. He climbed up into the engine cab and sat in the engineer's seat, trying to imagine his father in the same position during the war years. The cab smelled of rust and old grease. But underneath those scents was something else, something that reminded him of his father's workshop days of Saturday mornings spent learning to use tools and listening to stories about the importance of honest work. Raymond Warner had been a man who believed in the value of things that lasted, who could look at a broken piece of machinery and see not junk but potential. I hope you know what you're doing, Jack whispered to the gathering darkness. But as he sat in that silent locomotive surrounded by the ghosts of his father's world, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Marie's death, a sense of purpose that went beyond paying bills and getting through each day. He didn't know yet what that purpose might be, but for the first time in months, he was ready to find out. Jack pulled the envelope from his pocket, the one marked, "For Jack when the time comes." His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal that had remained intact for 17 years. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in his father's precise handwriting. Son, if you are reading this, it means you found engine 447. What I'm about to tell you might sound impossible, but every word is true. During the war, I wasn't just a railroad man, I was part of something bigger. Engine 447 carried more than coal and cargo. She carried hope when everything seemed lost, and she protected secrets that some would kill to possess. Look for the false panel behind the engineer's seat. Find the manifest from Operation Safekeeping. What the war couldn't take, the railroad kept. The truth is worth more than gold, but it belongs to those who lost everything. When you understand what this means, you'll know what needs to be done. Your father, Raymond Warner, 1978. Jack read the note 3 times, his heart beating faster with each reading. Engine 447, the same number as the locomotive sitting in Thompson's salvage yard. His father had known this specific train, had written about it with the kind of careful precision he brought to everything important in his life. 3 days after buying the locomotive, Jack found himself climbing into the attic above the garage, searching for his father's old toolbox. The wooden ladder creaked under his weight as he navigated between boxes of Christmas decorations and forgotten childhood memories. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light that managed to penetrate the small window, creating an almost cathedral-like atmosphere in the cramped space. He'd been putting off this moment knowing that opening his father's things would bring back memories he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But if he was going to work on engine 447, he needed proper tools, the kind of specialized wrenches and gauges that railroad men had used for generations. The toolbox sat in the far corner, exactly where he'd placed it after cleaning out his father's workshop 17 years ago. It was a large metal chest painted forest green with R. Warner, B&O Railroad, stenciled in white letters across the top. Beside it sat a smaller wooden box that Jack didn't immediately recognize in an old kerosene lantern with a brass base and glass chimney that had somehow escaped tarnishing despite the years. He pulled the lantern closer, remembering suddenly how his father had carried it during their nighttime walks around the rail yard when Jack was young. Raymond had always insisted that electric flashlights were too harsh, that the soft glow of kerosene allowed a man to see what really mattered without overwhelming his night vision. Railroad lantern shows you the truth, his father had said. Electric light just shows you what's there. Opening the wooden box revealed his father's personal effects. A pocket watch, some old photographs, and Raymond's leather-bound Bible. Jack lifted the Bible carefully, surprised by its weight. His father had read from it every night before bed, but Jack had never really examined it closely. As he opened the cover, a folded piece of paper fell out, landing on the dusty attic floor. The paper was yellowed with age and felt brittle between his fingers. In his father's careful handwriting, he read, Engine 447 B&O Freight, built March 1943. Special Cargo Manifest Operation Safekeeping. What the war couldn't take, the railroad kept. Look for the modifications behind the false panel. The truth is worth more than gold, but it belongs to those who lost everything. Raymond Warner, 1978. Jack read the note 3 times, his heart beating faster with each reading. Engine 447, the same number as the locomotive he'd just bought. His father had known this specific train, had written about it, with the kind of careful precision he brought to everything important in his life. Dad, Lisa's voice called from below. What are you doing up there, looking for Grandpa's tools? Jack called back carefully, folding the note and slipping it into his shirt pocket. He climbed down with the toolbox and lantern, trying to process what he'd just discovered. Lisa was waiting in the garage, still wearing her school uniform, but with her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than 16. Jenny's mom says the whole town is talking about you buying that train. She says people think you've lost your mind. People have always talked. Jack set the toolbox on his workbench and began examining the tools inside. Each one was wrapped in oiled cloth, perfectly preserved after nearly 2 decades of storage. Your grandfather used to say that the only opinions that mattered were the ones that came from people who understood what you were trying to accomplish. What are you trying to accomplish? Emma's question was direct but not accusatory this time. Something in her tone suggested she genuinely wanted to understand. Jack pulled the note from his pocket and handed it to her. I found this in your grandfather's Bible. Lisa read it twice, her eyebrows drawing together in concentration. Engine 447, that's the same number as the locomotive you bought. Yes, what's Operation Safekeeping? I don't know, but your grandfather wrote this note 30 years after the war ended. That means he was still thinking about it, still keeping track of that specific train. Lisa looked up from the note, and for the first time since he'd bought the locomotive, her expression held curiosity instead of anger. You think there's really something hidden in it? I think your grandfather was the most honest man I've ever known, and he wouldn't have written something like this unless it was true. That evening, after Lisa had gone to bed, Jack drove to the salvage yard with his father's tools and the kerosene lantern. Thompson had agreed to let him keep the locomotive there until he could arrange transportation to his property, a logistical challenge that would require permits, specialized equipment, and money he didn't have. The locomotive looked different in the darkness, more imposing somehow, as if the weight of mystery had given it new substance. He climbed into the engine cab and lit the lantern, adjusting the wick until it cast a warm, steady glow. The note had mentioned modifications behind a false panel. Jack began examining every surface in the pipe, running his hands along the walls and checking for irregularities. The soft light from the lantern revealed details he'd missed during his daylight inspection. Scratches in the metal that looked deliberate, slight variations in the paint that suggested some surfaces had been repainted. Behind the engineer's seat, he found what he was looking for. A section of the back wall that looked identical to the rest, but sounded hollow when he tapped it with his knuckles. The metal panel was held in place by bolts that had been painted over to match the surrounding surface, but the paint was slightly newer, applied over rust that had already formed. Using his father's tools, Jack carefully removed the bolts, working with the methodical patience that Raymond had taught him. The panel came away to reveal a hidden compartment about the size of a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, was a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs. His hand shook slightly as he opened the envelope. The first document was a cargo manifest dated April 15, 1943, listing the contents of a shipment from Baltimore Processing Center to Midwest Distribution Point. Classification restricted. Below that was a list of items that made no immediate sense. Personal effects category A through M. Artwork classification. Pending. Precious metals, assay required. Documents. Historical significance. Beneath the manifest were photographs, dozens of them in black and white. Some showed railroad workers loading wooden crates into freight cars. Others showed the interior of warehouses filled with paintings, sculptures, and what looked like religious artifacts. And in several of the photographs, Jack recognized his father's young face among the workers. One photograph in particular caught his attention. It showed Raymond Warner standing beside engine 447, but the locomotive looked different and newer, with modifications to the cargo area that weren't visible on the current engine. His father was holding something in his hands, though the photograph was too dark to make out what it was. At the bottom of the envelope was a letter written in his father's handwriting, but this one was addressed to Jack's son. If you're reading this, it means you found the locomotive and understood enough to look for the truth. What we did during the war was necessary, but it was also incomplete. The government asked us to transport recovered assets, things the Nazis had stolen from families across Europe. Some of it made it back to the rightful owners. Some of it didn't. Engine Frabben was part of a network that kept these items safe until they could be properly returned. I was supposed to finish the job, but life got in the way. The items are still out there, still waiting. If you choose to continue what I started, remember that this isn't about money. It's about returning what was stolen to people who lost everything. The map is in the firebox behind the brick on the right side. Be careful who you trust. Some people are still looking for what we hid. Raymond Warner. Jack sat in the locomotive cab for a long time, the lantern casting dancing shadows on the walls as he processed what he'd discovered. His father hadn't just worked on trains during the war. He'd been part of something larger, something that connected to the darkest chapter of the 20th century and the ongoing effort to repair some of its damage. The next morning, Max Donovan found him still sitting in the locomotive. Max was Oak Ridge's main mechanic, a man who could fix anything with an engine, and who had known Raymond Warner well enough to consider him a friend. "Heard you were out here all night," Max said, climbing into the cab with the ease of someone who had spent time around trains. "Lisa called my shop looking for you." She was worried. "Max, what do you know about my father's work during the war?" Max's expression grew cautious. "Ray was a good railroad man, worked harder than most, kept to himself more than some." "That's not what I'm asking." Max was quiet for a long moment, studying Jack's face in the morning light. "What did you find?" Jack showed him the documents and photographs. Max examined them carefully, his weathered hands gentle with the aging paper. When he finished reading, he handed everything back and sat against the locomotive's wall. "Your father never told you about the special trains. During the war, the railroad carried a lot of things that weren't on the regular manifests. Government cargo, military supplies, things that needed to disappear from one place and reappear somewhere else without anyone asking questions." Max's voice was careful, measured. Ray was one of the engineers they trusted with the sensitive shipments. "This cargo manifest talks about personal effects and artwork. That doesn't sound like military supplies." "No, it doesn't." Max was quiet again, and Jack could see him weighing how much to reveal. There were rumors after the war, stories about trainloads of stuff that the Nazis had stolen from Jewish families in Europe, paintings, jewelry, religious items. The government recovered some of it, but returning it to the rightful owners was complicated. A lot of the families were dead. Others had scattered across the world. So they hid it. They were supposed to catalog it, research it, find the families if they could. But the war ended. People had other priorities, and a lot of it just sat in warehouses gathering dust. Max looked directly at Jack. Some of the railroad men who had transported it thought that wasn't right. They thought if the government wasn't going to finish the job, maybe someone else should. Someone like my father. I'm not saying your father did anything illegal. I'm just saying he was the kind of man who believed in finishing what he started, especially when it came to doing right by people who had suffered. Jack thought about the letter his father had left for him about the unfinished mission and the items still waiting to be returned to their rightful owners. Max, if someone wanted to continue that work today, hypothetically, what would they need to know? Max smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Hypothetically, they'd need to understand that some secrets are worth keeping and some promises are worth keeping, even if they take decades to fulfill. He paused, looking around the locomotive cab with appreciation. They'd also need to know that they wouldn't be doing it alone. Some of us have been waiting a long time for Ray's son to figure out what his father left for him. The revelation that Max Donovan knew about his father's wartime activities changed everything for Jack. Over the next few days, he found himself looking at his hometown with new eyes, wondering who else might be keeping decades-old secrets. But first, he needed to examine the locomotive more thoroughly, and that meant understanding exactly what modifications his father and his colleagues had made to engine 447. Working by the light of his father's kerosene lantern, Jack began a systematic inspection of the locomotive's brake system. What he found confirmed Max's hints about the special nature of this particular engine. The brake mechanism had been modified in ways that made no sense for normal freight operations. Additional airlines had been installed, creating a secondary braking system that could be operated independently of the main controls. "This is brilliant," Max said when Jack showed him the modifications. "With this setup, you could stop specific cars without affecting the rest of the train. If you were carrying sensitive cargo that needed to be dropped off at unmarked locations, this would let you do it without the rest of the crew knowing." Lisa had started joining them in the evenings, bringing homework and a thermos of coffee while asking increasingly sophisticated questions about the locomotive's unusual features. Her initial embarrassment about her father's purchase had transformed into genuine curiosity, especially after she'd spent several nights researching World War II railroad operations on the internet. "I found something," she announced one evening, spreading printed pages across the locomotive's floor. There was a program called the Monuments Fine Arts and Archives Unit, the Monuments Men. They were responsible for recovering stolen artwork and cultural artifacts that the Nazis had looted from occupied countries. Jack examined the documents she'd printed. The official program had ended in the early 1950s, but Lisa had found references to ongoing efforts to locate and return stolen items well into the 1960s and beyond. "Look at this." Lisa pointed to a paragraph highlighted in yellow. "It says that railroad networks were often used to transport recovered items because they were more secure than truck shipments and easier to track than individual vehicles. But it also says that some railroad crews became personally invested in the mission and continued working on returns even after the official program ended." "That sounds like Grandpa," Lisa continued. "Mom always said he couldn't leave a job unfinished, even if it took him years to complete it." The brake system wasn't the only modification they discovered. The locomotive's coal tender had been fitted with hidden compartments, accessible only from the inside, and the firebox contained a removable brick that concealed a space large enough to hold documents or small valuables. Each discovery reinforced the picture of engine 447 as something far more significant than a simple freight locomotive. But their investigation was beginning to attract attention they didn't want. Twice in the past week, Jack had noticed the same sedan with Illinois plates parked on different streets around town, always positioned where the driver could observe the salvage yard. When he mentioned it to Max, the older man's expression grew serious. "Could be railroad enthusiasts," Max said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. "Or it could be people who have been waiting a long time for engine 447 to surface." "What kind of people?" "The kind who believe they have a rightful claim to what your father and his friends were hiding." That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He sat at his kitchen table with his father's documents spread before him, trying to piece together the scope of what Raymond Warner had been involved in. The photographs showed railroad operations across multiple states, suggesting a network that extended far beyond Oak Ridge. The manifest listed dozens of shipments over a period of several years, each one containing items described in careful but cryptic language. One photograph in particular troubled him. It showed his father standing with three other railroad men beside a freight camion. The men's faces were serious, almost grim, and they were surrounded by wooden crates marked with symbols Jack didn't recognize. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Last shipment, April 1947. Network disbanded. Items secure pending resolution." That was 4 years after the locomotive had been built, 2 years after the war had ended. His father had continued this work long after most people had moved on to peacetime concerns. The commitment suggested something deeper than professional duty. It suggested a personal mission that had shaped the rest of Raymond Warner's life. Lisa found him still sitting at the table when she came down for breakfast. "Dad, did you sleep at all?" "Not much." He showed her the photograph. "I'm trying to understand how big this operation was and why it mattered so much to your grandfather." Lisa studied the image carefully. "These crates look different from the ones in the other photographs. See how they're marked with those symbols?" She was right. The symbols looked like Hebrew letters, though Jack couldn't be sure. "What do you think they mean?" "I think they mean Grandpa wasn't just moving random stolen artwork. I think he was specifically helping Jewish families get their belongings back." Lisa's voice was soft with realization. "Dad, what if this wasn't just about recovering stolen property? What if it was about trying to restore what the Holocaust had taken from people?" The possibility hit Jack like a physical blow. If Lisa was right, his father hadn't just been a railroad man following orders. He'd been part of a network dedicated to repairing one of history's greatest injustices. The weight of that responsibility, carried for decades without recognition or support, began to explain why Raymond Warner had been so careful about keeping secrets and so insistent that some work was too important to abandon. "There's something else," Lisa said, pulling a piece of paper from her backpack. "I found this article about families who are still looking for items that were stolen during the war. There are organizations that help with the research databases of missing artwork and family heirlooms. Some of these families have been searching for 70 years. Jack read the article, which detailed the ongoing efforts of Holocaust survivors and their descendants to recover family treasures that had disappeared during the war. The stories were heartbreaking wedding rings that had been in families for generations, paintings that represented a lifetime of artistic achievement, religious artifacts that connected families to centuries of tradition. "If what Grandpa hid is connected to these families," Lisa said, "then maybe we have a responsibility to help finish what he started." That afternoon, Jack and Lisa drove to the library to research the organizations Lisa had found online. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian, proved to be an unexpected resource. She remembered the war years clearly and had vivid recollections of the unusual railroad activity that had characterized the period. "There were trains coming through here all the time that weren't on the regular schedule," she said, leading them to a section of local history materials. "Military shipments," they said, but some of us wondered why military cargo needed to be unloaded so secretly. "Your father was always very careful about who he talked to and what he said about his work." She pulled out a collection of local newspapers from the 1940s. "These might help you understand what was happening during those years." The newspapers painted a picture of a community deeply involved in the war effort, with local factories converted to military production and the railroad serving as a crucial supply line. But between the lines of the official stories, Jack began to see hints of the more secretive operations Max had described. References to special government shipments and classified cargo appeared regularly, always without details, but with a frequency that suggested significant activity. One article from 1946 caught his attention. It described a ceremony honoring local railroad workers for their distinguished service to the nation during the war years. Raymond Warner was listed among those honored, along with a dozen other men whose names Jack didn't recognize. "Mrs. Patterson, do you remember any of these other men who were honored with my father?" She examined the list carefully. "Oh my, yes, most of them have passed on now, but I remember them well. They were all railroad men, and they all seemed to work the same kinds of special assignments your father handled." She paused, her eyes growing distant with memory. "You know, they used to meet, sometimes even years after the war ended, quiet gatherings at Max Donovan's garage or at the rail yard. They said they were just old railroad men sharing stories, but there was something more serious about those meetings. Max Donovan was part of this, Max's father was. Max inherited more than just mechanical skills from his father. He inherited some responsibilities too. That evening, Jack confronted Max directly. "You've known all along what my father was involved in." Max nodded slowly. "I've been waiting 30 years for you to ask the right questions. Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because some knowledge is dangerous and some responsibilities are too heavy to carry unless you choose them willingly." Max looked at the locomotive, its metal surface gleaming in the light from their work lamps. "Your father left instructions that if anything happened to him, I was to wait for you to find your own way to the truth. He believed that if you were meant to continue his work, you'd figure it out on your own. Continue his work. How Max smiled grimly. By finding what he hid, researching who it belongs to, and making sure it gets back to the right families. There are items worth millions of dollars hidden in locations your father established across 3 states. Maps, documentation, provenance records, everything needed to complete the returns he started. And if I choose not to continue, then the secret dies with us, and families who have been searching for their heritage for 70 years will never find what they're looking for. Max paused. But I don't think that's the kind of man you are, Jack. I think you're exactly the kind of man your father hoped you'd become. As the night deepened and the salvage yard grew quiet around them, Jack felt the weight of decisions settling onto his shoulders. His father had left him more than a rusted locomotive. He'd left him a choice that would define the rest of his life. The practical problems remained the mortgage, Lisa's college fund, their precarious finances, but somehow they seemed smaller in the face of the history he'd uncovered. In the soft glow of the kerosene lantern, Jack could almost see his father's face, could almost hear his voice saying what he'd said so many times during those workshop lessons. Some jobs take a lifetime, son, but that doesn't mean they're not worth starting. Lisa had been right about one thing. The symbols on those crates weren't just inventory marks. They were Hebrew letters that connected Engine 447 to families whose lives had been shattered by hatred and systematic theft. Jack didn't read Hebrew, but he understood enough now to know that each symbol represented people who had lost everything, whose heritage had been stolen, along with their possessions. The next breakthrough came when Lisa discovered the coal tender's false bottom. She had been measuring the external dimensions of the tender against its internal capacity when she noticed a discrepancy of nearly 6 inches. Working together with careful precision, they found the hidden release mechanism and lifted away a section of flooring that had been disguised to look like a permanent part of the structure. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas and sealed in a waterproof container, was a collection of documents that took Jack's breath away. The wartime supply manifest was far more detailed than the one they'd found earlier, listing not just general categories of items, but specific pieces with detailed descriptions and in many cases photographs. "Dad, look at this," Lisa whispered, holding up a photograph of an ornate silver menorah. Attached to it was a typed description. "Ceremonial menorah silver with semi-precious stones belonged to the Rosenberg family of Vienna. Seized March 1938 during Anschluss operations. Current status recovered. Awaiting family location." The manifest contained dozens of similar entries, wedding rings with detailed engravings, paintings by artists whose names Jack didn't recognize, but whose work was obviously valuable religious texts written in Hebrew and other languages he couldn't identify. Each item was cataloged with the same careful attention to detail, as if whoever had compiled the list understood that these objects represented more than their monetary value. But it was the accompanying document that revealed the true scope of what Raymond Warner had undertaken. Titled Project Sanctuary Phase 2 Implementation. It outlined a network of railroad men across the Midwest who had committed to continuing the work of returning stolen items to Holocaust survivors and their families long after the official government programs had ended. "This is incredible," Lisa said, reading over his shoulder. Grandpa wasn't working alone. There were railroad workers in Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, all coordinating to move these items safely and research their proper ownership. The document included a hand-drawn map showing locations across 3 states where items had been hidden, pending resolution of ownership questions. Some locations were marked as resolved, with dates in the 1950s and 1960s. Others remained unmarked, suggesting they still contained unreturned items. Lisa, Jack said slowly, "I think we're looking at something worth millions of dollars. But more than that, we're looking at the life's work of men who believed that some wrongs were too important to leave uncorrected." That evening brought both hope and concern. Lisa had spent hours online researching organizations that helped Holocaust survivors locate missing family possessions. She'd found contact information for 3 different groups, including one based in Washington that maintained a database of recovered items still seeking their rightful owners. "I think we should reach out to them," Lisa said. "If we're going to do this right, we need expert help with the research and authentication." But their research had also revealed a troubling possibility. Among the online forums dedicated to recovering Holocaust assets, they'd found posts from people claiming to represent the families of Nazi officers who had been unjustly deprived of items they considered family property. The language was carefully legal, but the intent was clear. There were people actively searching for the same hidden assets that Raymond Warner and his network had spent decades protecting. "We need to be careful who we contact," Jack said. "If word gets out that we found documentation of hidden items, we might attract the wrong kind of attention." His concern proved justified. Next morning, when he arrived at the salvage yard to find clear evidence that someone had been searching the locomotive during the night, nothing had been damaged, but tools had been moved, and the hidden compartments they'd discovered showed signs of being examined by someone who knew what they were looking for. Max arrived 30 minutes later, took one look at the locomotive, and immediately understood what had happened. "We're not the only ones who know about Engine 447, he said grimly, "and we're probably not the only ones who have copies of the documentation." "What do you mean your father was careful, but he wasn't the only man involved in this network?" When the operation was disbanded in 1947, each location was supposed to destroy their copies of the master list. But some of the railroad men kept copies just in case. In case of what? In case someone needed to finish the job someday. Or in case someone needed to protect the hiding places from people who had no right to them. Max examined the locomotive more carefully, checking each hidden compartment for signs of tampering. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for. They found the brake system modifications, the coal tender compartment, even the firebox hiding place. But they didn't take anything. Maybe they didn't find what they were looking for. Or maybe they were just confirming that this is the right locomotive before they make their real move. The bank notice arrived that afternoon, delivered by certified mail with Lisa's signature required. Jack read it twice before the words fully registered. They had 2 weeks to bring their mortgage current or face foreclosure proceedings. The amount due was more than he could possibly raise through conventional means. Lisa read the notice over his shoulder, her face growing pale. "Dad, what are we going to do?" Jack looked at the manifest they'd found with its careful documentation of items potentially worth millions of dollars. The temptation was almost overwhelming. If even a fraction of what his father had hidden was still recoverable, it could solve their immediate financial problems and secure Lisa's future. But the letters and documents made clear that these items belonged to specific families, people who had already lost everything once and were still searching for the pieces of their lives that had survived. "We're going to do the right thing," he said finally. "We're going to find out who these items belong to and make sure they get returned. Even if it means we lose our house. Your grandfather spent 30 years protecting other people's heritage. I'm not going to dishonor that by treating his life's work like a treasure hunt." Lisa was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady with resolve. "Then we better work fast. If there are people looking for what Grandpa hid, and if we're running out of time to save our house, then we need to find those items and get them to the right families before someone else gets to them first." That evening, they made their first contact with the outside world. Lisa had found the email address for Dr. Rachel Bennett, a historian at Georgetown University who specialized in Holocaust asset recovery. Her online biography indicated she had worked with families around the world to locate and return stolen artwork and family heirlooms. Lisa composed a careful email explaining that they had discovered documentation related to a post-war network that had been involved in protecting recovered Nazi loot and pending return to rightful owners. She included photographs of 2 items from the manifest, the silver menorah, and a painting described as Portrait of Rebecca Oil on Canvas, signed I. Goldstein, belonged to the Goldstein family of Prague. The response came within 6 hours. Dr. Bennett wrote that both items were listed in databases of missing Holocaust assets and that she would be willing to travel to Indiana to examine the documentation in person. She also included a warning: "Be very careful about who else you contact regarding this material. There are individuals and organizations who have been seeking these items for decades. Not all of them with legitimate claims or honorable intentions." 2 days later, Rachel Bennett arrived in Oak Ridge driving a rented sedan and carrying a briefcase full of authentication equipment. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She examined the locomotive with the appreciation of someone who understood both history and engineering, asking detailed questions about the modifications and taking photographs of the hidden compartments. But it was her reaction to the documents that convinced Jack they had discovered something truly significant. Dr. Bennett studied each page with intense concentration, occasionally making notes or cross-referencing items with information from her laptop computer. "This is extraordinary," she said finally. "I've been working in this field for 25 years, and I've never seen documentation this complete from the informal networks that operated after the war. Your father and his colleagues kept records that rival anything the government produced. How many of these items are still missing? At least 60% of what's listed here. Some families have been searching for these specific pieces for decades." She looked up from the manifest with something approaching awe. "If even half of the locations marked on this map still contain what your father hid there, you're looking at the largest recovery of Holocaust assets in the past 30 years. Lisa leaned forward. "What do we need to do to return them to the right families? First, we authenticate everything. Then we research current family members and verify claims. Finally, we arrange for secure transportation and legal transfer." Dr. Bennett paused. "But I have to warn you, this process can take months or even years for complicated cases, and you'll need to be prepared for the possibility that some people will challenge your right to make these returns." "What kind of people?" "Descendants of Nazi officials who claim family ownership. Art dealers who argue they purchased items legally from previous owners. Museums or private collectors who believe they have legitimate title." Dr. Bennett's expression grew serious. "And unfortunately, some individuals who see Holocaust asset recovery as an opportunity for personal profit rather than historical justice." Jack thought about the sedan with Illinois plates and the evidence that someone had searched the locomotive. "Dr. Bennett, if someone wanted to prevent these items from being returned to their rightful owners, what would they do?" "They'd try to get to them first. They'd claim legal ownership through forged documents or dubious purchase agreements. Or they'd simply take them and disappear, knowing that most families don't have the resources to pursue international legal challenges. Then we better move fast." Dr. Bennett smiled for the first time since arriving. "Mr. Warner, I think your father would be very proud of the man you've become. And I think we're about to give some families the greatest gift they could ever receive: the return of their heritage and the knowledge that someone cared enough to protect it for 70 years. The discovery of the Wehrmacht officers' personal effects changed everything about their understanding of Engine 447's wartime role. Hidden behind a false panel in the engineer's way that required removing 3 different sections of equipment to access, they found a collection of German military items that told a story none of them had expected. The effects were wrapped in the same oiled canvas as the other documents, but these materials were different in both origin and implication. Nazi military medals, including an Iron Cross and several campaign ribbons, photographs of German officers in dress uniform, personal letters written in Gothic script that none of them could read, and most significantly official Wehrmacht documents bearing stamps and signatures that looked authentic even to untrained eyes. "This doesn't make sense," Lisa said, examining a photograph that showed a German officer standing beside what was clearly Engine 447, though the locomotive looked different, cleaner, more military in its appointments. "Why would Grandpa have kept Nazi materials with the stolen Jewish artifacts?" Dr. Bennett studied the items with the careful attention of someone who had seen similar collections before. "These aren't trophies," she said finally. "These are evidence. Look at the dates on these documents and compare them to the dates on your father's manifest." The dates told a story that was both more complex and more disturbing than anything they had imagined. The German materials dated from 1943 to 1945, covering the period when Engine 447 had been used for its original purpose. But the American documentation began in 1945 and continued into the late 1940s, suggesting that the locomotive had been captured along with its cargo and crew. "I think Engine 447 was originally a German train," Dr. Bennett explained. "The Nazis used specially modified locomotives to transport stolen artwork and valuables from occupied territories back to Germany. When the Allies captured these trains, they found not just the stolen items, but also the German personnel responsible for the operations." Lisa pulled up information on her laptop about Nazi art theft operations. There were special SS units responsible for looting cultural artifacts from Jewish families and museums. They used the railroad system to move everything back to Germany for storage or distribution to Nazi officials. So this locomotive was captured with its cargo intact. It looks that way, and your father's network inherited the responsibility for sorting out what belonged to whom and returning it to the rightful owners. Dr. Bennett handled one of the German documents carefully. These personal effects probably belonged to the officer who was commanding the transport when it was captured. Keeping them with the other materials would have been important for establishing the provenance of the stolen items. The implications were staggering. Engine 447 hadn't just been used to transport recovered Holocaust assets, it had been the original vehicle used to steal them. The locomotive sitting in Thompson's salvage yard was a direct link to one of the most systematic art theft operations in human history. But the discovery raised new questions about the people who had been watching them. If descendants of Nazi officials knew about the locomotive's history, they might believe they had legitimate claims to items their relatives had acquired during the war. The thought that Lisa and he might be confronting people with such connections made Jack's stomach tighten with anxiety. Dr. Bennett, he said, if someone wanted to claim ownership of these items based on their family's Nazi connections, would they have any legal standing? Absolutely not. International law is very clear that items stolen during the Holocaust remain the property of their original owners or their heirs, regardless of subsequent transactions. She paused. But that doesn't stop people from trying, especially when the amounts involved are significant. Some will use intimidation. Others will file frivolous lawsuits hoping to delay returns, and some will simply try to steal the items before legitimate claims can be processed. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car pulling into the salvage yard. Through the locomotive's windows, they could see the same Illinois sedan that had been spotted around town now parked directly beside the tracks. Two men in expensive suits got out and began walking toward Engine 447 with the confident stride of people who believe they belong there. Dr. Bennett, Jack said quietly, I think we're about to meet some of those people you were warning us about. The older of the two men was in his 60s, well-dressed and carrying himself with military bearing despite his civilian clothes. His companion was younger, perhaps 40, with the kind of intense focus that suggested either legal training or law enforcement background. They approached the locomotive without hesitation, as if they had every right to examine it. Excuse me, the older man called out. I'm looking for Mr. Jack Warner. I believe he's the current owner of this locomotive. Jack climbed down from the cab, leaving Dr. Bennett and Lisa inside with the sensitive documents. I'm Jack Warner. Can I help you? My name is Victor Lehman, and this is my associate, Mr. Carter. We represent certain parties who have a legitimate interest in this locomotive and any materials that might be associated with it. The accent was faint but distinctly German, and the way Lehman's eyes swept over the locomotive suggested familiarity with its history. We understand that you've discovered some items that belonged to my family during the war years. Items that were taken from us without proper legal process. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Jack said carefully. Carter stepped forward, his demeanor more aggressive than his companions. Warner, we have documentation proving that this locomotive was used to transport property belonging to the Lehman family, property that was confiscated by American forces in 1945 without compensation or due process. What kind of property? Lehman reached into his briefcase and produced a folder containing what appeared to be official documents. Artwork, jewelry, religious artifacts, and family heirlooms that had been in the Lehman family for generations. When the Americans captured the transport train, they seized everything without distinguishing between legitimate family possessions and items that may have been acquired through other means. The claim was delivered with such confidence that for a moment Jack wondered if there might be some truth to it. But then he remembered the photographs and documents Dr. Bennett had authenticated, the careful records his father had kept, and the detailed provenance information that proved these items had been stolen from Jewish families. Do you have documentation proving your family's ownership of specific items? We have sufficient documentation to establish our legal rights, Carter said. What we need now is cooperation in locating and recovering the items that belong to our clients. Lisa appeared in the locomotive's doorway, and Jack could see that she had been listening to the conversation. Her expression was a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that reminded him strongly of her mother when Marie had encountered someone she didn't trust. Dad, she said loudly enough for Lehman and Carter to hear. Dr. Bennett wants to know if these gentlemen have appointments. She says she's working with several organizations that track fraudulent claims against Holocaust assets. The effect on Lehman was immediate and telling. His composed demeanor slipped for just a moment, revealing something much harder underneath. Dr. Bennett is here. You know her, Doctor. Bennett has interfered with several legitimate recovery efforts in the past. She has a tendency to side with claimants whose documentation is less than complete while refusing to acknowledge clear legal ownership by families who can prove their rights. Dr. Bennett emerged from the locomotive cab, and her expression, when she saw Lehman, was anything but friendly. "Victor Lehman, I should have known you'd eventually surface here." Margaret, still playing protector to people who can't prove their claims, still representing people who think they can legitimize theft through legal paperwork. The tension between them was immediate and personal, suggesting a history that went beyond professional disagreement. Jack found himself caught between two groups of people who clearly knew more about the situation than he did. "Dr. Bennett," Jack said, "perhaps you could explain what's going on here. Mr. Lehman represents a network of people who claim their families were wrongfully deprived of property during the war. They file claims against recovered Holocaust assets, hoping to delay or prevent returns to actual victims." She faced Lehman directly. What they don't mention is that their family property was originally stolen from Jewish families who were murdered or displaced during the Holocaust. Lehman's response was swift and practiced. That's Dr. Bennett's interpretation. The legal reality is that many items were acquired through legitimate transactions during the war years, transactions that were later ignored by occupying forces who assumed everything had been stolen. "Legitimate transactions," Dr. Bennett repeated with contempt. "You mean sales forced on Jewish families at gunpoint, or purchases from SS officers who had confiscated items from people being sent to concentration camps?" Carter stepped forward again, apparently deciding that diplomacy had failed. "Or, Warner, we're prepared to make you a substantial offer for any items you may have found. Our clients are willing to pay well above market value to recover their family's property." The offer was tempting in a way that made Jack's chest tighten with guilt. Lisa's college fund, their mortgage, their entire financial future could be secured with a single transaction. But the photographs of concentration camp victims wearing the jewelry now being claimed by Lehman's clients made the moral choice clear. "I appreciate your offer," Jack said, "but I'm not interested in selling anything. If we find items that belong to specific families, we'll work to return them to the rightful owners." Lehman's mask of civility finally slipped completely. "Mr. Warner, you're making a serious mistake. The items you're protecting belong to people who are no longer alive to claim them. Their families are scattered around the world, if they even exist. You're choosing to preserve museum pieces instead of providing for your own family's future. How do you know about my family's situation? Small towns talk, Mr. Warner. Everyone knows about your financial difficulties and your daughter's need for college funding. We're offering you a practical solution to real problems." The fact that these strangers had researched his personal finances made Jack angry in a way that surprised him with its intensity. "I think you should leave." Carter reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "When you change your mind, and you will change your mind, call this number. Our offer won't remain open indefinitely." After they left, Dr. Bennett sat down heavily on the locomotive steps. "Jack, I need to tell you something. Victor Lehman isn't just representing clients with questionable claims. He's the grandson of SS Obersturmführer Erich Lehman, who was one of the officers responsible for art looting operations in occupied France and Poland. His grandfather was a Nazi, one of the worst. Erich Lehman oversaw the systematic theft of artwork, jewelry, and cultural artifacts from thousands of Jewish families. He was killed in 1904 when Allied forces captured the transport he was commanding." She looked up at the locomotive. "This transport, engine 447. Lisa climbed down from the cab, her face pale but determined. "So Victor Lehman is trying to recover items his Nazi grandfather stole from Holocaust victims. That's exactly what he's trying to do. And he's been doing it for 20 years, using legal intimidation and fraud to claim ownership of recovered Holocaust assets." Dr. Bennett stood up, brushing dust from her clothes. "Which means that what we're protecting here isn't just valuable. It's evidence of war crimes that some people will do anything to keep hidden." Later that evening, Jack drove Dr. Bennett back to her hotel, leaving Lisa to continue researching the families mentioned in Raymond's documentation. They rode in silence for several minutes, both processing the confrontation with Lehman. "How dangerous is he?" Jack finally asked. Dr. Bennett stared out the window at the passing storefronts of Oak Ridge, most closed for the night. "Victor Lehman himself isn't physically dangerous. He's a businessman and considers himself a gentleman. But the people he works with, the collectors, and those who claim family connections to Nazi officers, Some of them are willing to do whatever it takes to recover what they see as their property. What Jack couldn't see was the man in the black sedan parked half a block from Thompson's salvage yard. As soon as Jack's truck disappeared around the corner, he slipped out and moved toward the fence surrounding the property. He wore dark clothes and carried a small backpack, moving with the confidence of someone who had done similar work many times before. 20 minutes later, Victor Lehman's phone rang. The call was brief, the information precise. No, they hadn't found the map or the specific locations, but they now knew that Raymond Warner's network had hidden items across 3 states. More importantly, they knew Dr. Bennett was involved, which meant this was no longer a simple recovery operation. It was a race against a well-connected professional with resources and legal backing. Lehman hung up and turned to Carter, who sat in the hotel room reviewing the documents they'd brought. We need to accelerate our timeline, contact our associates in Chicago and Milwaukee, tell them to be ready to move on short notice. As Carter made the calls, Lehman walked to the window and stared out at the small-town street below. What no one in the Warner family knew was that Victor Lehman's interest in Engine 447 went beyond recovering valuable artwork and jewelry. There were documents hidden among those treasures, papers that could either vindicate or condemn his family name, depending on how they were interpreted. For 3 generations, the Lehman family had lived with whispers and accusations. After the war, Eric Lehman had been listed as killed in action, his body never recovered. But rumors had persisted that he had been executed by Allied forces after being captured with a train full of stolen property, rumors that had followed the family from Germany to America in the 1950s. Victor's father had spent his life trying to escape the shadow of those rumors, changing their name slightly from Lehman to Lehman, moving from city to city whenever questions about their past surfaced. But Victor had chosen a different path. Instead of running from his grandfather's legacy, he had decided to confront it, to find the truth, and if possible, to rewrite the narrative. The coded railway schedule, all that Dr. Bennett discovered, tucked inside Eric Lehman's personal effects, proved to be the key that unlocked the entire scope of the Nazi looting operation. Written in a mixture of German military code and railroad terminology, it detailed a network of transport routes that had moved stolen assets across occupied Europe and into Germany throughout the war years. Working late into the night in Max Donovan's garage, Dr. Bennett used specialized software on her laptop to decode the schedule, while Lisa cross-referenced the locations with modern maps, and Jack examined the physical evidence they'd collected from the locomotive. The picture that emerged was both more systematic and more personal than any of them had expected. This isn't just a list of train routes, Dr. Bennett explained, pointing to columns of alphanumeric sequences that had initially looked like random letters and numbers. It's a complete inventory system. Each code represents a specific family's possessions with detailed information about where the items were taken from and where they were sent for storage or distribution. Lisa had spread railroad maps across Max's workbench, marking locations mentioned in the schedule with colored pins. Look at this pattern. The train started in major cities Paris, Amsterdam, Prague, and then moved through smaller collection points before heading to central storage facilities in Germany. Collection points, Jack repeated, studying the map. You mean places where they gathered stolen items before shipping them? More than that, these were processing centers where SS officers sorted through family possessions and decided what was valuable enough to send back to Germany. Dr. Bennett's voice was heavy with the weight of what she was describing. Wedding rings were melted down for gold. Artwork was evaluated and cataloged. Family photographs and documents were destroyed because they had no monetary value. The systematic nature of the operation was staggering. Each entry in the schedule included not just transportation details, but also information about the families whose possessions had been stolen, names, addresses, estimated values, and in some cases notes about whether the families had been relocated, a euphemism that everyone understood meant sent to concentration camps. But it was Max who made the connection that transformed their understanding of what Raymond Warner and his network had accomplished. Look at these dates, he said, pointing to a series of entries from late 19 and early in 19. These trains were captured by Allied forces before they reached their destinations. The stolen items were recovered while they were still in transit, which means the American military inherited not just the stolen goods, but also the complete documentation of where everything had come from. Dr. Bennett nodded. Your father's network had access to the original Nazi records. They knew exactly which families each item belonged to. Lisa looked up from the laptop where she'd been researching some of the family names mentioned in the schedule. "I've found the Rosenberg family, the ones who own that silver menorah. 3 survivors immigrated to New York after the war. The family still exists and they've been registered with Holocaust asset recovery organizations for 60 years. The revelation that specific families could still be located and contacted made the abstract concept of returning stolen items suddenly concrete and urgent. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were family treasures that real people had been searching for their entire lives. "How many of the families listed in this schedule are still traceable?" Jack asked. Dr. Bennett pulled out a thick folder of reference materials. "Based on my experience with similar cases, probably 30 to 40%. Some family lines were completely destroyed during the Holocaust. Others scattered across the world and lost touch with their heritage. But for the families we can locate, this documentation represents the most complete provenance records I've ever seen." The scope of the recovery operation was becoming clear. But so were the challenges they faced. The schedule referenced storage locations across 3 states, most of them on private property, that had changed hands multiple times since the 1940s. Some items had been moved multiple times over the decades as Raymond Warner's network adapted to changing circumstances and security concerns. "We're going to need help," Dr. Bennett said. "This is too big for us to handle alone, and we're going to need legal support if Victor Lehman and his associates try to interfere with the returns." Lisa had been unusually quiet for the past hour, studying the schedule and cross-referencing information on her laptop. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that made everyone stop what they were doing. "There's something else. I've been looking at the family names in the Nazi records and comparing them to Holocaust databases." She turned her laptop around so they could see the screen. Some of these families weren't just robbed. They were specifically targeted because of what they owned. The screen showed a database entry for the Goldstein family of Prague, whose portrait painting had been listed in Raymond Warner's manifest. According to the Holocaust records, Isaac Goldstein had been a prominent art dealer before the war, with a collection that included works by several important European artists. The family had been among the first arrested when German forces occupied Prague, and their entire collection had been confiscated within days of their deportation. "They weren't random victims," Lisa continued. "The Nazis had lists of Jewish families who owned valuable artwork or cultural artifacts. They targeted these families specifically for what they could steal from them. The personal nature of the targeting made the crimes feel even more immediate and brutal. These families had been murdered not just for who they were, but for what they possessed. The artwork and jewelry that Raymond Warner had spent decades protecting represented not just material wealth, but the deliberate destruction of cultural heritage and family identity. Which makes returning these items even more important," Dr. Bennett said. "For the surviving family members, recovering their heritage is about more than money. It's about reclaiming their identity and honoring the memory of relatives who died protecting these treasures." Max had been examining the physical locomotive while they worked on the documentation, and his mechanical expertise was revealing additional secrets about Engine 447's wartime modifications. "This engine was built for more than just transportation," he announced. "Look at these modifications to the suspension system and the reinforced flooring in the freight cars. This locomotive was specifically designed to carry extremely heavy loads without damaging delicate cargo. Heavy loads like artwork and sculptures? Exactly. And look at this." Max showed them a section of the locomotive's interior that had been fitted with specialized clamps and padding systems. These modifications would have protected paintings and fragile artifacts during transport. Whoever designed this understood that they were carrying irreplaceable cultural treasures. The evidence suggested that Engine 447 had been one of the Nazis' premier art transport vehicles, used specifically for moving the most valuable stolen items. When Allied forces captured the locomotive, they had not just recovered random loot, but had intercepted one of the primary vehicles used in the systematic destruction of Jewish cultural heritage. "No wonder Victor Lehman is so interested in this locomotive," Jack said. "If his grandfather was commanding this transport when it was captured, then Engine 447 probably contains evidence of his specific war crimes." Dr. Bennett nodded grimly, "which means Lehman isn't just trying to recover family property. He's trying to prevent evidence of his grandfather's crimes from becoming public." Lisa looked up from her research with an expression that mixed excitement with apprehension. I think I know why they're so desperate to stop us. I've found a reference to SS Obersturmführer Erich Lehmann in a war crimes database. He was being investigated by Allied authorities for art theft and murder when he was killed in 19. The investigation was never completed because the evidence was lost when his transport was captured, lost or hidden by people who wanted to protect it until the right time. Dr. Bennett said with certainty, "Your father and his network weren't just returning stolen property. They were preserving evidence of war crimes and waiting for someone who could use it properly." The weight of responsibility was becoming overwhelming. They weren't just dealing with valuable artifacts or family heirlooms. They were protecting evidence that could provide closure for families who had been waiting 70 years for justice. At the same time, they were confronting people who had spent decades trying to bury that same evidence. "What happens next?" Jack asked. "Next, we start contacting families," Dr. Bennett said. "We begin the process of authentication and documentation, and we prepare for Victor Lehman and his associates to escalate their efforts to stop us." "How do we prepare for that?" Max smiled grimly. "The same way your father did. We work fast, we work carefully, and we make sure the truth gets documented before anyone can destroy it." Lisa closed her laptop and looked around at the three adults who had become her partners in this unexpected mission. "One more thing. I've been thinking about what Victor Lehman said about our financial problems and my college fund." "Lisa, no, Dad. Listen, he was right that we need money, but he was wrong about why that matters." She gestured toward the locomotive and the documents they discovered. "Grandpa spent 30 years protecting these families' heritage because he believed it was the right thing to do, even though it probably cost him money and definitely put him at risk. If we give up now because we're worried about our own problems, then everything he worked for was meaningless." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that some things are more important than money. And I'm saying that I'd rather graduate from community college, knowing we did the right thing, than go to Harvard, knowing we sold out Holocaust survivors for our own benefit." The resolution in her voice reminded Jack so strongly of Marie that for a moment he couldn't speak. His daughter had inherited more than her mother's appearance. She had inherited her moral compass and her ability to see clearly through complex ethical situations. "Then we finish what your grandfather started," he said finally. "All of it." Across town in his hotel room, Victor Lehman sat alone with a glass of scotch, staring at a faded photograph he kept in his wallet. It showed a younger version of himself standing with his father beside a hospital bed. The old man in the bed was barely recognizable, withered by age and illness, but his eyes still burned with the intensity that had defined him during his life. Erich Lehman had not died in 1945 as the official record stated. He had escaped to Argentina with the help of sympathizers and had lived there under an assumed name until the early 1990s, when advanced cancer had finally forced him to reach out to the family he'd abandoned 50 years earlier. Victor had been 28 when he first met his grandfather, a newly minted lawyer with a comfortable life and no knowledge of his family's darkest secrets. The revelation of Erich's identity and history had shattered Victor's understanding of himself and his place in the world. For 3 weeks, as his grandfather lay dying, Victor had listened to stories of war and acquisition. Never theft, never looting, always acquisition. Erich had spoken of his role as a cultural preservationist, protecting valuable artworks from destruction. He had painted himself as a misunderstood hero whose methods might have been harsh, but whose intentions were noble. But there had been moments of clarity between the morphine doses moments, when the old man's carefully constructed narrative had cracked, revealing glimpses of the truth beneath. Victor had seen the fear in his grandfather's eyes when he spoke of certain trains, certain shipments, certain families whose possessions he had acquired. The last coherent thing Erich Lehman had said to his grandson was a request disguised as a mission: "Find train 447, find what they took from me, clear our name." Victor had spent the next 20 years fulfilling that request, building a network of collectors, researchers, and legal experts who could help him locate and recover items associated with his grandfather's operations. He had convinced himself that he was seeking justice for his family, that the Lehman name had been unfairly tarnished by wartime propaganda and post-war politics. But with each discovery, each document, each photograph, the narrative had become harder to maintain. The evidence didn't show a cultural preservationist. It showed a methodical thief and a willing participant in the systematic destruction of European Jewish culture. And now Engine 447 had surfaced along with documentation that threatened to expose not just what his grandfather had done, but the elaborate fiction that 3 generations of Lehmans had constructed around those actions. If Dr. Bennett and the Warners succeeded in their mission, the last pretense of family honor would be stripped away, leaving only the naked truth of Eric Lehman's crimes. Victor drained his glass and made a decision. He had come too far to turn back now. Whatever was hidden in those storage locations needed to be recovered, not to clear the Lehman name, but to finally end the cycle of deception that had defined his family for 70 years. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had hoped never to use. "I need your team ready by tomorrow." Yes, all of them. This is no longer about recovery, it's about erasure. The discovery of Raymond Warner's secret journal changed everything they thought they knew about Engine 447 and the mission they had inherited. Hidden inside the locomotive's firebox, protected by a false back wall that had been expertly disguised, the leather-bound journal contained 30 years of carefully documented entries, revealing the true scope of what Raymond and his network had accomplished. Lisa found it on a cold morning when she was helping Jack clean out debris from the firebox in preparation for restoration. Her hand touched something that felt different from the expected metal and ash. Working carefully with a small crowbar, they pried away what appeared to be a solid back wall to reveal a waterproof container that had been sealed since the late 1970s. The journal was thick-bound in brown leather, with Raymond Warner's name embossed in faded gold letters. Inside, written in his careful handwriting, was a record spanning from 1945 to 1978, telling a story of moral complexity none of them had anticipated. "My God," Dr. Bennett whispered as she read the first entries. "Jack, your father wasn't just returning stolen items to families. He was actively redistributing Nazi wealth to Holocaust survivors who needed immediate assistance." The early entries described the chaos following Engine 447's capture. While bureaucrats debated procedures for returning stolen items, survivors languished in displaced persons camps with nothing. Raymond documented his network's controversial decision to liquidate some unidentifiable items to provide immediate aid to suffering families. One entry from August 1945 read, "First redistribution completed. Use network contacts to liquidate items whose ownership cannot be established and transferred funds to 3 families in immediate need." This goes against official policy, but official policy is letting people starve while their own property sits in storage. The journal revealed the personal cost of these decisions. Raymond documented the strain of secrecy on his marriage and his concerns about involving his young son in what had become a lifelong mission. By the 1960s, the network had successfully returned hundreds of items and provided financial assistance to nearly 1,000 Holocaust survivors. But significant assets remained hidden, either because owners couldn't be located or because the items were too dangerous to move without proper legal protection. Raymond's final entry from 1978 concluded, "All remaining locations secured, all documentation preserved. If something happens to me, the maps and records will guide whoever continues this mission. The items hidden in these locations represent more than money. They represent the hope that someday justice will matter more than procedure." Dr. Bennett closed the journal, her hands shaking slightly. "Jack, your father and his network returned an estimated $50 million worth of stolen assets to Holocaust survivors over 30 years. Based on these records, approximately $137 million worth of items remain in secured locations. Items that are documented, researched, and ready for return to families who can prove ownership." Lisa looked up with determination. "The $187 million. It's not just what's hidden. It's the total value of everything Grandpa's network protected. There's something else," Dr. Bennett said, pointing to a passage near the end. "Your father knew that Victor Lehman's family was looking for these items. He documented several attempts by Nazi descendants to locate and claim recovered assets, including specific encounters with Victor Lehman in the 1970s. Max had been examining the locomotive while they read the journal, and his discovery added another layer to the already complex situation. I've found another sealed compartment, and this one contains actual items, not just papers. The compartment beneath the locomotive's coal tender contained representative samples of the hidden treasures: jewelry, small paintings, and religious artifacts. Each item was tagged with a number corresponding to entries in the journal, complete with family names and histories. Lisa picked up a small silver locket containing photographs of a young couple in 1930s clothing. On the back, an inscription in Hebrew had been carefully engraved. Look at this. These aren't just artifacts. They're pieces of people's lives, family memories, that survived the Holocaust because someone cared enough to protect them. Emma's right, Jack said. This isn't about money. It's about giving families back the pieces of their relatives' lives that survived when everything else was destroyed. Dr. Bennett nodded, which means we need to move quickly. Now that we know the full scope of what your father protected, we can begin contacting families. But we also need to be prepared for Victor Lehman to escalate his efforts to stop us. The hand-drawn map found inside Raymond's journal showed locations across Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio where assets remained hidden, each site marked with symbols corresponding to detailed inventory lists and GPS coordinates that had been updated over decades. Lisa's satellite imagery research revealed both opportunities and challenges. Most locations were still accessible, but 3 sites had been developed, one beneath a shopping mall parking lot and another on land now occupied by a housing subdivision. The scope of the recovery operation was staggering, as was the time pressure they faced. Victor Lehman's surveillance had intensified with unfamiliar cars spotted near their house and evidence of attempted break-ins at Max's garage. They're escalating. Dr. Bennett warned, Lehman knows we're close to something significant. Max outlined a practical approach. We work at night in teams, documenting everything before moving anything. Lisa had already located several families, including Rachel Rosenberg, a 91-year-old survivor, who had been searching for her family's silver menorah for 75 years. The abandoned limestone mine outside Oak Ridge became their first major target. According to Raymond's journal, this primary repository contained the most valuable and historically significant items. Dr. Bennett examined the entrance with appreciation. Your father chose well. Mine shafts provide natural protection from temperature fluctuations and humidity. Max and Mark Donovan brought specialized equipment for accessing the underground chambers, while Mrs. Patterson joined, despite her age, carrying authentication materials and additional documentation preserved from her late husband's railroad days. What they found exceeded their highest expectations. The chamber had been converted into a professional storage facility with climate control systems powered by a generator Raymond Warner had somehow kept operational for decades. Wooden crates lined the walls, each labeled with codes corresponding to his journal. Lisa began photographing everything systematically. Each crate was marked with family names and countries of origin: Rosenberg from Vienna, Goldstein from Prague, Weiss from Berlin, creating a visual map of cultural destruction across Nazi-occupied Europe. Opening the first crate revealed hand-illuminated religious texts, family photographs in silver frames and jewelry, bearing the craftsmanship of generations of European artisans. Jack found a note beneath a collection of gold coins. Wedding gift from my grandmother, carried by the Levy family from Poland to Paris to New York. May these coins provide hope to those who have lost everything else. Raymond Warner, 1952. He wasn't just preserving artifacts, Jack said. He was preserving stories. Dr. Bennett discovered a painting by Isaac Goldstein depicting pre-war Jewish life in Prague. According to Lisa's research, Goldstein had created it in Theresienstadt concentration camp and entrusted it to a fellow prisoner who survived. Their work was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Mark Donovan appeared at the tunnel entrance. Oh, we have company. 3 SUVs with Illinois plates, and they're not here for sightseeing. Through the entrance, they saw Victor Lehman and at least 6 associates setting up what appeared to be a professional recovery operation, complete with metal detectors, excavation equipment, and armed security personnel. They found us, Dr. Bennett said grimly, and they're planning to take everything. Lisa continued photographing rapidly while Max identified a secondary exit. We can get out through the maintenance tunnel, but we'll have to leave most of the items behind. No, Jack said firmly. My father spent 30 years protecting these families' heritage. We're not abandoning it now. Mrs. Patterson revealed she had brought more than authentication tools. Your father left instructions for exactly this situation. These are transfer orders signed by federal authorities and witnessed by federal judges. They give us legal custody of recovered Holocaust assets pending authentication and return to rightful owners. Dr. Bennett immediately contacted federal authorities, but help would take at least 2 hours to arrive. Then we hold them off for 2 hours, Jack decided. Whatever it takes. The confrontation at the mine entrance was unlike anything Jack had imagined when he first bought Engine 447. Victor Lehman stood with armed security personnel, legal representatives, and professional recovery specialists, controlling access to the mine shaft, while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate archaeological operation. Mr. Warner Lehman called out, "I believe you have something that belongs to my family." Lisa held up the list of rightful heirs she'd discovered. "Actually, we have something that belongs to these families. Families whose possessions were stolen by your grandfather and his SS unit during the war." Lehman's composure slipped. "Those families are dead. Their claims died with them." "No, they're not," Lisa countered. "Rachel Rosenberg is 91 years old and lives in Brooklyn. She's been looking for her family's menorah since 1948. The Goldstein family has relatives in 3 countries searching for their father's artwork. These families are very much alive, and they have legal rights to their heritage." Dr. Bennett informed Lehman that federal authorities had been contacted, but he dismissed her concern. "We have obtained local search and recovery permits and legal documentation proving our family's ownership of items transported on Engine 447. Sheriff's deputies arrived seemingly supporting Lehman's operation. "This is a lawful archaeological investigation," one announced. "These people are interfering with a permitted operation." Max stepped forward with the confidence of someone who understood local politics. "Deputy Williams does. Your permitted operation include armed security personnel threatening local residents, because I've got the county commissioner on speed dial." The threat of political complications gave Lehman pause, but security personnel began positioning themselves more aggressively. Lisa made an unexpected move. She began live streaming the confrontation to social media. "This is Lisa Warner reporting from outside Oak Ridge, Indiana, where my family has discovered a cache of Holocaust assets that my grandfather preserved for 70 years. We're trying to return these items to the families they were stolen from, but we're being confronted by people who claim their Nazi relatives owned them legitimately." Within minutes, thousands were watching as Holocaust education organizations and Jewish community groups shared the stream. Phone calls poured in from news organizations and advocacy groups, while Lehman received calls suggesting he had contingency plans. Mr. Warner Lehman said with cold determination, "You have 10 minutes to turn over any items you've removed from this site. After that, my associates will retrieve them by whatever means necessary." The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Cars began arriving from Oak Ridge, not just railroad enthusiasts, but dozens of residents who understood the significance of their town's hidden history. Mrs. Patterson confronted Lehman directly. "Victor Lehman, I knew your grandfather. He came through Oak Ridge in 1945 as a prisoner of war, and I saw what he had stolen from families he helped murder. Your grandfather was a thief and a killer, and you're not going to profit from his crimes in my town." Sheriff's deputies found themselves caught between orders and community responsibility, as Lisa's livestream ensured any violence would be witnessed by thousands. FBI agents eventually arrived, securing the site under federal jurisdiction. This is Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI's art crime team. This site is now under federal protection. Anyone interfering with this investigation will be arrested and prosecuted to the fullest extent of federal law. Lehman was forced to withdraw, but not before warning Jack, "This isn't finished. These items belong to my family and I will recover them through proper legal channels." That night, as Jack sat alone with the foreclosure notice still pinned to his refrigerator, a knock came just after midnight. Victor Lehman stood on the porch without his security team or legal entourage. "May I come in, Mr. Warner? I think it's time we had an honest conversation." Jack hesitated, then invited him inside. Lehman noticed the foreclosure notice immediately. "Your family has financial problems. I could solve them with a phone call. A simple transfer of funds and this house would be secure." "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just a request to examine one item before it's returned to the claimants, a small leather-bound Hebrew Bible from one of the crates. It has particular significance to my family." Jack studied the older man's face. "The Bible is evidence in a federal investigation now. I couldn't get access to it, even if I wanted to." Lehman nodded slowly. "Then perhaps you would be willing to hear a story about that Bible and my grandfather." What followed was a revelation that changed everything Jack thought he knew about Engine 447's history. According to Lehman, his grandfather Eric hadn't been killed in 1945, as official records stated. He had escaped to Argentina and lived under an assumed name, until the early 1990s when terminal illness forced him to contact the family he'd abandoned 50 years earlier. During those final weeks, Eric had revealed that the Hebrew Bible taken from Rabbi David Morgenstern contained more than scripture. In its margins, he had recorded the names and destinations of every family whose possessions passed through his hands, not just as a record of Nazi theft, but as insurance against wartime allies who proved less than honorable. My grandfather was many things, Mr. Warner, but in the final years of the war, he was also an informant. He provided information to American intelligence about Nazi art theft operations, hoping to save himself from the gallows. Lehman placed an envelope on the table. This is a copy of a letter my grandfather wrote to your father in 1956. Read it and you'll understand why I've spent 20 years looking for Engine 447. The letter, written in German with Raymond Warner's English translation, revealed the most shocking twist in the entire story. Some high-ranking Allied officers had diverted recovered Holocaust assets to their own collections. Eric Lehman had documented these thefts in the Bible's margins, or creating a record of both Nazi crimes and Allied corruption. So you're not trying to recover Nazi loot, Jack said. You're trying to expose American officers who stole from Holocaust victims after the war. I'm trying to clear my family's name, not by denying my grandfather's crimes, but by revealing the full truth of what happened. The Bible contains not just his records of Jewish families, but also his documentation of which American officers took which items. The next morning, Jack met with Dr. Bennett and Agent Martinez, showing them Lehman's letter. This could explain some cold cases in our files investigations that were started and then abruptly closed without resolution, Martinez admitted. If Lehman is telling the truth, this Bible could implicate former military officers and government officials in one of the most significant art thefts of the 20th century. The Bible, when examined, contained page after page of tiny, precise handwriting in the margins, and between lines of Hebrew text names, dates, inventory numbers, and most damning of all, the initials and ranks of American officers next to specific items they had allegedly diverted. This is dynamite, Agent Martinez whispered. This could trigger reinvestigations of cases that have been closed for decades. A complex arrangement was reached. Lehman would examine the Bible under FBI supervision and provide sworn testimony about his grandfather's role in exchange for withdrawing all claims to items recovered from Raymond Warner's network. He would also fulfill financial promises to the Warner family, not as payment for access, but as restitution for the harm his family had caused. 6 months later, Jack stood beside the restored Engine 447 as its bell rang across Oak Ridge for the first time in decades. The locomotive now served as the centerpiece of the Raymond Warner Memorial Holocaust Education Center, housed in the former Thompson Salvage Yard building. Dr. Rachel Bennett had become the center's director, transforming Oak Ridge into an unexpected hub for Holocaust recovery research. Your father's documentation methods have become a model for recovery operations around the world, she told Jack as students arrived for educational programs. The financial outcomes had exceeded their expectations. Grateful families had contributed enough to secure Lisa's college education, pay off the family's mortgage, and establish an endowment for ongoing recovery work. Lisa had received a full scholarship to Georgetown University to study international relations and Holocaust studies. The most meaningful rewards were the human connections. Rachel Rosenberg, now 92, traveled from Brooklyn for the center's dedication, bringing 3 generations of family members to see their great-grandmother's menorah for the first time. My mother carried this when we fled Vienna, Rachel said. She held it when the Nazis separated our family at the train station. I thought it was lost forever, but Raymond Warner kept it safe until someone could bring it home. Victor Lehman had kept his word. The examination of the Morgenstern Bible had triggered investigations that recovered additional Holocaust assets from the estates of former military officers. Lehman had published a memoir acknowledging his grandfather's crimes while documenting his complex late-war actions, an account respected by historians for its honesty. Max Donovan had become an unexpected ambassador for the Recovery Network. The thing people don't understand, he told audiences, is that Raymond Warner and his friends weren't trying to be heroes. They were just railroad men who believed that finishing the job was more important than following orders. Lisa spent her summer break working as an intern at the center, reinforcing her commitment to international justice. I want to help other families find what Grandpa helped preserve, she told Jack. There are still thousands of items out there waiting to be returned. The locomotive bell rang every day at noon, reminding visitors that some stories take generations to complete. As Jack listened to it on that anniversary morning, he reflected on how his foolish decision to spend his last $3,000 on a rusted locomotive had transformed not just his family, but an entire community. Lisa stood beside him wearing her Georgetown University t-shirt and holding a photograph of her grandfather. "Dad," she said, "do you think Grandpa knew what would happen when he hid all this documentation?" "I think he hoped," Jack replied. "I think he hoped that someday someone would care enough to finish what he started." Mrs. Patterson, now serving as the center's volunteer coordinator, approached with fresh correspondence from families worldwide. More letters today. 3 families in Canada want to visit, and there's a researcher from Germany who thinks we might have information about items stolen from a synagogue in Berlin. The work continued as Raymond Warner had known it would. Each returned item led to new discoveries. Each family reunited with their heritage, helped locate other missing pieces. The network established in the 1940s had become a model for recovery efforts, still returning Holocaust assets in the 21st century. As the bell sound faded, Jack embraced Lisa and smiled at the locomotive that had changed their lives. Engine 447 would never run again, but it had completed a more important journey from symbol of destruction to symbol of hope, from evidence of humanity's capacity for evil to proof of its capacity for justice. "You know what I think Grandpa would say if he could see all this?" Lisa asked. "What he'd say that sometimes the longest journeys start with the smallest steps and that the most important destinations are the ones you can't see when you begin." The bell fell silent, but its message continued to resonate. Some treasures are worth more than gold. Some stories take generations to complete. And sometimes the people who look most foolish turn out to be the ones who understand what really matters. In a small Indiana town, a man mocked for buying a rusted locomotive had helped dozens of families reclaim their heritage and prove that justice delayed is not always justice denied. The locomotive sat silent on its tracks, no longer carrying cargo, but still carrying hope. Hope that families scattered by history could be reunited with their past hope, that truth could survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it, and hope that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to honor the responsibilities that history placed in their hands.